The Occoquan Radio Podcast is a private production and is not affiliated with the town of Occoquan. Opinions expressed on the podcast are solely those of its host and guests. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Occoquan Radio Podcast, where we bring you 10 to 15 minutes of irregular, unscheduled updates on things Occoquan and beyond. I'm your host, Ernie Porta, and as I mentioned in the last episode, we're off for 2 weeks, so a podcast wasn't planned, but we found some time and with some mobile equipment are coming to you nevertheless, albeit a little later than usual. And since we're using some different equipment, I might sound a little bit different. In Town Business this episode, we'll briefly discuss the town's military tribute banners program. Then we'll discuss the fire of 1916 in our Occoquan history segment and address a myth related to the fire. And as usual, we'll close with upcoming events in town. Although we're mobile, I hope you'll still enjoy this episode of the Occoquan Radio Podcast. In Town Business for this episode, I want to highlight the Occoquan Military Tribute Banners Program, which is administered in collaboration with Occoquan VFW Post 7916. This is a very successful and popular program that was initiated by our VFW a number of years ago, in which residents, businesses, friends, and visitors can sign up to sponsor a banner honoring a U.S. military veteran. Participants typically celebrate a family member, ancestor, or friend. Banners are mounted in town and stay up Memorial Day through Veterans Day. For information on how to be a new sponsor or on how to renew a prior sponsorship, which involves reusing a previously purchased banner, go to www.militarytributebanners.org and select Virginia/Occoquan under the Banner Program menu, or stop by Town Hall or VFW Post 7916. In our Occoquan history segment this episode, we're going to revisit the Great Occoquan Fire of August 25, 1916, which was written about in the June 2016 edition of the Occoquan Historical Society's newsletter. The fire was one of the seminal events in Occoquan's 20th century history, and one of the reasons most of the structures in town today post-date 1916. Various newspapers reported on the blaze, and it is from them that we have the most detailed information. A concise report was printed in the Fairfax Herald of September 1, 1916, under the title, Occoquan Swept. Fire Nearly Destroys Prince William Town. Hotel, bank, 12 stores burn. Fire, which swept the western part of Occoquan, the little town near the district workhouse in Prince William County Friday afternoon, the article reads, completely destroyed 12 stores and houses and numerous outbuildings and caused $40,000 in loss, partially covered by insurance. No one was injured. 40 persons will be forced to rely on neighbors for homes. The fire originated at 2:30 o'clock in the old Alton Hotel, now occupied by Mrs. Whedon. The explosion of an oil stove is thought to be the cause. At 6 o'clock, after the arrival of No. 6 Engine Company from Alexandria, the fire was under control. Swept by a stiff breeze, the fire completely destroyed the old Alton Hotel, the new 2-story Bank of Occoquan, the house and store of W.S. Lynn, both frame, the 2-story house of Carl Underwood, the frame house of Wade Hamill, the frame M.E. Church, South, the Allen House, the brick manufacturing plant of the Viadex Manufacturing Company, manufacturers of speedometers, whose buildings were owned by W.S. Lynn, the house of Mrs. Carl Lynn, the barn of R.S. Woodward, and about 100 frame sheds and barns. But for the quick formation of bucket brigades, which relayed water from Occoquan Creek nearby, and the timely arrival of No. 6 Engine of Alexandria, which made a record run of 45 minutes from Alexandria, 17 miles away, the whole village would have been destroyed. The wharves and the eastern section of the town were not touched, nor was the district workhouse, more than a mile away across Occoquan Creek. The chemical engine from the workhouse and a number of trustees aided in the rescue work. About 75 men worked in bucket lines. The government tug Louise gave assistance by pumping water. The Washington Post of August 26, 1916, provided a more comprehensive account under the lengthy headline, $50,000 Occoquan Fire. Business section wiped out and 1 person hurt. Many residences destroyed. Flames started by oil stove in absence of owner from home. beyond control of Citizens Bucket Brigade until arrival of Alexandria automobile engine. Historic Occoquan, at the head of Occoquan Bay, 25 miles south of Alexandria, Virginia, the article begins, was visited by a fire yesterday afternoon that wiped out the business section of the little town with a loss of $50,000, on which there is insurance of probably half that amount. The big new automobile fire engine of the Alexandria Fire Department went to the scene in response to a call for aid and making the run at a new record speed, saving the town from being wiped out entirely. The fire was started by an oil stove in the house of Mrs. J. Hood Whedon in the center of the business section adjoining the Occoquan Bank during Mrs. Whedon's absence. When the fire was discovered, the entire populace of the village turned out, men, women, and children, to fight the fire. With a swift wind blowing from the burning building toward the bank, the flames quickly destroyed the Whedon house and its contents and began to eat up the bank building. Businesses, houses, and residences in the path of the fire were emptied of their stocks and furnishings, which were placed in the middle of the narrow streets, only to be consumed by the fire as it progressed. When it was seen that the bank building was doomed, all the valuables were placed in the vault, which was locked. The bank will only lose the building on which there is good insurance. During the fire, James M. Barbie, cashier of the bank, N.C. Davis, W.S. Lynn, W.H. Hamill, Milton Botts, W.H. Smoot, H.G. Leary, George W. Hunter, Tyson Janney, and other businessmen and property owners led the fight against the flames. Mr. Botts, who had one of his feet badly cut in a manner he could not explain, was the only person injured. As there is no fire department in Occoquan, the citizens formed a bucket brigade to fight the flames, which were beyond control from the beginning. When the Alexandria automobile engine arrived, the flames had jumped the creek at the old wooden-covered bridge and partially destroyed a building. The destruction of her home is the second misfortune that has befallen Mrs. Whedon in less than 2 weeks. On August 13th, her daughter, Miss Virginia Whedon, after being rescued from drowning in Occoquan Bay, had her entire scalp torn from her head by the shaft of the motorboat that saved her from the water. The Washington Post article then goes on to list the burned properties. The Washington Star of August 26, 1916, also reported on the event. The headline read, "Occoquan visited by serious fire loss between $40,000 and $50,000, and many persons are homeless. Prisoners fight flames." Between 40 and 50 residents of Occoquan last night, the article reads, slept in the homes of friends or in the Oddfellows Hall here as a result of a disastrous fire which swept away their homes and other property in the afternoon. The loss is between $40,000 and $50,000. The fire originated about 2:30 o'clock from an unknown cause in the rear part of the home of Mrs. J. Hood Whedon on Mill Street, the principal thoroughfare of this little town. By the time the flames were discovered by Mrs. Whedon, who had gone to the front porch of her home a few minutes before, they had gained considerable headway. The cries of Mrs. Whedon were heard by neighbors, and soon an alarm was sounding throughout the village calling for help. A bucket brigade was formed. Water was taken from nearby wells and also from Occoquan Creek, on which the town lies. The firefighters, however, were unable to do much good against the flames, which were fanned by a strong wind. Although Mrs. Whedon's home, formerly the Alton Hotel, was built of brick, it was soon a mass of ruins. With the outbreak of the fire, James Barbie, cashier of the Bank of Occoquan, which adjoined the hotel, placed all the money in the vault and then went to join the firefighters in their efforts to keep the fire from spreading to the bank building. Their efforts, however, were without avail, as the roof of the building was soon a mass of flames, and in a few minutes the interior of the institution was wiped out. It was said the money and the papers in the vault were believed safe. The fire soon spread northward, and soon the general merchandise store and dwelling of W.S. Lynn went up in smoke. About the time this building caught fire, Ralph Whitaker, son of W.H. Whitaker, superintendent of the district workhouse across the creek, heard of the fire and dispatched the chemical engine stationed at the institution to the scene. For a time, the volunteer firemen used the chemicals to advantage, but the wind shifted the flames to the rear, and soon the dwelling and the Occoquan M.E. Church South were on fire. In connection with the sending of the fire apparatus to Occoquan, Mr. Whitaker with several guards took 75 prisoners from the workhouse to the scene, and they worked diligently in carrying furniture, clothing, and other property from threatened buildings. They also formed bucket brigades. After the flames destroyed the Lynn store and residence, they burned through the residence of Oliver Underwood, and then jumped across an alleyway and destroyed the home of Wade H. Hamill. Calls for help were telephoned to nearby towns, and an effort was made to reach Alexandria Telephone to ask for fire apparatus to be sent. Communication, however, with that place could not be had, and a telephone message was sent to the Washington Star asking for the fire department of Alexandria to be notified. It was on the message sent from the Star that the big motor fire engine of that town was dispatched to the scene. The run of 15 miles over a road which is bad in spots was made in 43 minutes. When the fire apparatus in charge of Captain Henry Beach pulled into town, he said later it looked as if the entire place would soon go up in flames. The motor engine was backed up to the Occoquan Creek, and residents assisted the firemen in carrying the hose several hundred yards, and soon water was being thrown, but not before the fire had jumped across the street and destroyed the plant of the Viadex Manufacturing Company, a dwelling occupied by Walter Neal, and the ice house of Dr. Frank Hornbaker. It was but a short time later that the firemen succeeded in checking the fire in the northward spread. The wind, which had shifted, also aided the firemen as the flames were kept from a number of buildings. Telephone wires and brick walls of some of the buildings began to fall while the firemen were working nearby, and for a short time menaced them. When it was seen there was but little chance of saving the church and property on Commerce Street, articles of furniture were removed to places of safety. It was not until the church and several residences on Commerce Street had been burned down that the fire was actually under control. It was about 6 o'clock last evening before the danger of the flames spreading was past. The firemen and residents, as Bucket Brigade, worked long into the night putting out the smoldering flames in the burned buildings. No one was injured during the fire, although the flames had wiped out the places on Mill Street, and several venturous ones had narrow escapes from falling walls. As soon as it was seen that the fire was under control, preparations were being made by the more fortunate residents to care for those whose property had been destroyed. The Oddfellows Hall was thrown open, and several families spent the night there, while others were taken into the homes of friends. Those are the newspaper accounts of the fire. If you are interested in seeing a photographic map of the buildings affected by the fire as described, visit the newsletter tab of the Occoquan Historical Society website at www.occoquanhistoricalsociety.org and go to the June 2016 newsletters.
That's the intro sound for our Rumor Mill Shredder segment. This is where we pay homage to the fact that while for much of its history Occoquan was a prosperous mill town, the only mill in operation today is the rumor mill. Here we take on urban legends, myths, rumors, or other similar topics that need straightening out.
For our segment this episode, we're going to address one of the myths regarding the fire of 1916 that we just reviewed. As those of you who have been on one of our historic walking tours may know, one traditional story among some locals is that the fire was caused by an elderly woman who was burning leaves and lost control of the fire. As each of the newspaper accounts just read indicate, however, that was not the case. Yet you may have noticed as well that among the newspaper articles there are also some inconsistencies and errors. Among the latter, for example, is the Washington Post reporting that the fire, quote, crossed the old wooden-covered bridge, end quote. The bridge, however, was not an old wooden-covered bridge, but rather an iron Pratt truss bridge. The only part of it that was wood was the flooring. As for the fire itself, two accounts attribute it to the explosion of a gasoline iron stove, unattended, by Mrs. J. Hood Whedon. An account I did not relate in full, however, noted that despite reports that Mrs. Whedon's gasoline stove had started the fire, Mrs. Whedon denied that she had been even using such a stove. Persons who reached the scene shortly after the fire had been discovered, according to this account, expressed their opinion that the flames were of spontaneous combustion, as they appeared to have started under the flooring in the rear of the house. So there was no elderly woman burning leaves, and it may not even have been caused by Mrs. Whedon's stove. All we know for sure about the devastating fire of 1916 is that it started somewhere in Mrs. Whedon's house in the old Alton Hotel. As usual, we will close with a brief survey of upcoming events in town. First among these is the annual Spring Friends of the Occoquan cleanup, for which the town is again a host site. Meet at Town Hall between 9 a.m. and noon on Saturday, April 5th to pick up your gloves and trash bags and help us clean up the town's riverbank and areas adjacent to the river. There will be free grab-and-go refreshments available. Make sure to wear sturdy shoes and a tire that can get muddy. This is a rain or shine event, and to help in planning, please sign up at www.friendsoftheoccoquan.org. 2 other events will also take place on the 5th. VFW Post 7916 will hold its annual spring sidewalk sale from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. at 204 Mill Street, and Earth Addictions will hold a Gather, Ground, and Grow event at 7:30 p.m. Then, on Sunday, April 6th, Madigan's Waterfront Restaurant will be the site of a murder mystery dinner starting at 5 p.m. For information on these and other events in Occoquan, go to www.visitoccoquanva.com. Again, that's www.visitoccoquanva.com.
That brings us to the end of this episode of the Occoquan Radio Podcast. Make sure you don't miss an episode by searching for us on the podcasting app of your choice and hitting the subscribe button. I'm your host, Ernie Porta. Thank you for listening.